Native peoples weren't just moving through the landscape without having any effect on it. It wasn't true that they were just, striding through forests, harming nothing at all, and this kind of unrealistic picture of how anybody would engage with their environment is also being overturned by this new research. This new research shows that people engaged in the environment and modified it in ways that made it more beneficial for people in all kinds of really interesting ways. I think is a really important insight, and partly because it counters some of the old rhetoric in favor of colonialism. The sort of story of native peoples not cultivating the land is connected to that bad history of justifying colonialism.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining me. I think this might be a little bit of a strange one to draw people into. I'm really fascinated by sort of environmental factors and the way that they've changed things for humans over time. And then the origin story of the potato kind of was what grabbed me initially. But I feel like, how has it been for you sort of saying, I write books about potatoes? Like, you have 2 books just on the potato, right? As well as, a lot of other research that you do, and lots of articles that focus on just that as a way to tell history. But how have you found it sort of bringing people in and talking to them that way?
Well, there's been a bit of a difference between the way that academics have responded and the way that non-academics have responded. So, and one of the things that I've been interested in over some years is how to try to make the histories that I want to tell things that make sense to people who aren't academic historians. So, I'm an academic historian. It's not that I don't want to talk to the academy. And you can tell that in a way from reading the book, that's the voice in some ways that comes very naturally to me. But I also really don't think there's any point for our doing a lot of history if it's actually just staying very hermetically in the world of professional historians. What we want to be doing is showing why history is relevant and matters. And so I've been interested in trying to think about how to tell those stories that we want to tell in ways that make sense to people who aren't professional historians. And one of the things that I've learned is that food is a very, very good way of doing that because people understand food. So if you say to somebody, I'm writing a history of the potato, people have something to say about it and they understand that, and then you can then have a conversation. And whereas if you say, I'm writing about the emergence of liberal governance in the 18th century, some people might be very interested. Other people will say, that sounds very complicated. So part of what I found is that it's, actually more than just that people react to it, but that talking about potatoes really seems to give people a way of talking about themselves.
So interesting.
People have a response and they say, my father manufactured potato harvesting equipment. Or, we went to Peru and there was an extraordinary variety of potatoes. It was really interesting. I didn't know about that. Or, my grandmother had this particular way of cooking potatoes that still has an impact on me. So there's, somehow it's a way that people connect in a way that I think if you said I'm working on carrots, I don't think it would have the same impact.
Well, we've made carrots so very homogenous and they're all straight and orange, right? But as you said, with going to Peru, I think there's something really exciting about a black potato or a really long potato or something, and it's something that's I can connect with this because I love potatoes, I eat them for breakfast, lunch and dinner and dessert. But this is something wildly different.
Well, I don't think it's unique, but I do think it's special. And I think that's part of the reason that I wanted to talk about the potato's global career, because it is an exceptionally successful global migrant. It's traveled all over the world and people think of it as a very ordinary foodstuff in almost all parts of the world. So it's unusual in that regard, and that it's not geographically pinned the way many, many foods are. Other foods are like that. Chili peppers also have a certain global quality. I was listening just yesterday, actually, to a radio broadcast about a new book on the history of the chili pepper in China, talking about how chili peppers, which also come from the Americas, like potatoes, how they've become so embedded in Chinese cuisine and in the cuisines of regions like Sichuan, etc. So there are other foods that also traveled very successfully from the Americas to everywhere in the world. But potatoes are particularly remarkable in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. And as well, potatoes, we have... There are a lot of instances where it's so embedded in the national food, you know, like here it's sort of like bangers and mash. Russian vodka is made from potatoes. I was really, really interested to find out when sort of preparing a little bit for this that 60% of the foods that are common now came from the Americas during that age of exploration, right? How come the Americas were so blessed with so many amazing crops?
So yeah, that's a really important moment in human history and certainly in culinary history, but much more broadly as well. So there was a term that was invented in the 1970s by a historian called Alfred Crosby, who wrote a really pioneering book called The Columbian Exchange. And so that's Columbian as in Christopher Columbus. And he argued that one of the major impacts of European invasion and colonization of the Americas was the dissemination all around the world of a whole array of really important foodstuffs. And so he called this exchange, this movement of foods from the Americas to everywhere in the world, and from Europe and the old world into the Americas. That movement he called the Columbian Exchange. And it clearly was really transformative because, not just to talk about very simple culinary examples, not, bigger historical impacts. That's what took tomatoes to Italy. That's what took chili peppers, not just to China, but also to India, along with potatoes, along with tomatoes, things that now feature largely in the subcontinent's cuisine. It's also what took peppers to Hungary, where you get, chicken paprikash as a classic dish. It took sweet corn or maize to Venice and that region around there, which is what gives us polenta, that typical dish of the Veneto. And it brought roast potatoes to Britain. It brought vanilla to ice cream everywhere. It brought chocolate to Switzerland and all around the world. It brought tobacco to smokers everywhere. So there was a huge transformation of foodstuffs and seasonings and flavorings that resulted from them. It also brought a whole variety of foods from Europe and Eurasia and Africa to the Americas. So the flows went both ways. And many of those movements were absolutely disastrous for humanity. And that's what brought sugarcane to the Americas, which was not a native crop to the Americas, but then became the primary, not the only, but the primary driver for the enslavement of 12 million West Africans who were forcibly taken to labor and die on plantations in the Americas to grow sugarcane. So that was not a crop native to the Americas. Coffee actually also, which was grown largely with enslaved labor, coffee doesn't come from Brazil, for example. It comes from the Middle East. So there was a huge but you asked why did this happen? So I think it happened largely because the Americas had been cut off is the wrong word, because it's a vast region. It wasn't cut off from anything, but it had been geographically separate from the rest of the Americas since the land bridge in the Bering Strait basically had disappeared, with some exceptions of people traveling from Pacific Islands into the west coast of South America. There's some really interesting work on how people were traversing the Pacific.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. So there was movement coming that way, and also, of course, when we know that the Vikings were in North America in the Middle Ages.
Yeah. Yeah, but it was kind of popping in and out, right? but whereas everywhere else was very much interacting, and we're trying to figure out how to get to one another, and we had the Silk Road, and people felt like they knew what the world was made up of, right? There was this whole other side that was just doing its own thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there had been trade, as you were saying, from between Europe, Asia, Africa going on for a very, very long time, but not involving the Americas. And so that meant that there were a whole series of animals and plants that evolved in their own way without spreading into the rest of the world. And so that's why, I mean, Europe is also, and where we sit now, and Africa and Eurasia are also blessed with many foodstuffs. But they were foodstuffs that were familiar to people in Eurasia and Africa and in Europe. But there was this one part of the world, this big part of the world, whose foodstuffs were unknown to everybody else.
And so when they found them, I mean, was it an immediate excitement for people? Was there like, look at all these amazing crops? Or was it like, oh, what are all these weird looking like roots? And
well, so I mean, there's an old scholarship on this which says that was the usual response, and that Europeans, particularly when they got to the Caribbean and then invaded Mexico and then invaded the Andean region, that their reaction was to say, this is all very weird, it's unfamiliar, it's not mentioned in the Bible, we don't think it's edible. And I think most of that is wrong. I mean, Europeans quickly realized that these foods were edible, at least for the people who were in the Caribbean and in Mesoamerica, because that's what people were eating. So they wrote back very interestingly saying, oh, the people around the Aztec capital or in Mexico in general, they eat a kind of grain which they called something like maíz or maize or something. It's their bread. It's what they eat instead of bread. They don't have any wheat, so they eat that thing. So I mean, of course, they certainly knew it was edible. Whether it was good for Europeans was another question. So there was a good deal of debate about whether it was good for you to eat foods that came from very different places.
Interesting. Okay, that we may be suited to diets from our heritage or something.
Exactly. So the idea of kind of being, eating locally that we have now has quite a long history. So we think about eating locally right now as something that's a good thing to do environmentally, that maybe it helps link you in with the natural world where you are. But I don't know that we don't necessarily say that foods from right here where you are better for you. But we have an idea that there's a sort of suitability between where we are and the foods that grow there that make those the appropriate foods to eat. And that's what people in the West have thought for thousands of years, and with some exceptions. So sort of little spices, for example, or things that you might flavor up your food with. That was fine to have from somewhere else, but you weren't going to build your entire diet out of cinnamon if you lived in England. You would build it out of what grew there. So there was a lot of concern about whether eating foods that were very unfamiliar to the European body in particular would be dangerous to the European body. So there was a lot of anxiety about that. But that was particularly because it was considered that travel was a huge stress to your body overall. That traveling just put your whole constitution out of whack. You'd be in a different environment, you'd be living a different daily rhythm, you'd be having a different sleep regime, you might be terribly homesick, which would upset you, that everything was just very stressful for your body, and that the last thing you should do was augment this stress by stuffing yourself with foods that your body didn't know.
I suppose that might actually be relevant as well today, We would probably say the same thing. If you're not feeling well, just have something very bland, have some bread. So, I mean, I read about this man, Antoine Parmentier, who went on quite the crusade to change people's minds, right?
Yeah, there's a street in Paris that's named after him, and if you look at the street signs, they say Parmentier introduced the potato to France. And if you go to, there's a famous cemetery in Paris, the Père Lachaise cemetery, where, I mean, all kinds of people of great note are buried there, and he's buried there. His tomb is there. And to this day, people leave sort of decorative offerings, little votive gifts of potatoes on his tomb.
Thank you so much for bringing us. Well,
Yeah, so you can Google it and see wonderful pictures of the tomb with, little potatoes all around it. So his reputation lives on as the man who brought this food to the French, and that's not entirely undeserved, but it's quite undeserved. So people in France had been eating potatoes for quite a long time before Parmentier. He didn't introduce potatoes to France, but he absolutely promoted them. His adult life was fundamentally a massive crusade to encourage people to eat more potatoes, which he thought were a really super healthful food, much better than a diet built around wheat bread. And he had nothing bad to say about potatoes. And so he's right to be remembered for his incredible enthusiasm for potatoes and his serious efforts in the 18th century to encourage their consumption.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was kind of a bit of an everyday food, like a poor man's food almost, right? It was just sort of like something that was very easy, and it grew in a much smaller area in compared to previous like grain that had been grown, and it was very calorie dense, right? So it was quite cheap, right? I'm on the understanding. So it was something that was just very easily accessible, and a bit of like, well, a staple as it is today. And he sort of, did he try to bring it up and make it fashionable? Or was it more of just grow more potatoes, it's great for the nation?
It was more the latter, although part of his campaign to try to get people to grow more potatoes, for a variety of reasons why he was so enthusiastic about potatoes, and you've mentioned a whole lot of them, and there was a larger context which made the food supply, or what we might call food security, a real focus for governments in the 18th century in lots of European countries. So there were lots of reasons why he was looking for a good food. But his efforts to try to get ordinary people to eat more potatoes partly involved an attempt to make them fashionable. And there was a widespread belief among members of the elite in the 18th century that ordinary people would imitate the habits of the more wealthy, and that if the wealthy could set a good example, ordinary people would follow. And so there was, and you see this really clearly, for example, in the attempt precisely to get ordinary people to stop eating white bread and to try to eat more potatoes, or at the very least whole grain bread, which there was also the subject of a big push in the 18th century. White bread had long been considered not just the prestige bread, but also was without doubt not just considered, but was the most expensive bread. And it was what wealthy people generally ate. And so in the late 18th century, when there was an attempt to try to get people off white bread onto cheaper, more nourishing substances, lots of members of the aristocracy said, oh, well, we're going to start eating brown bread. Everybody's going to notice, and they'll all imitate us. They'll admire it, and they'll say, oh, if they're doing it, it must be the right thing to do. This was something lots of people in Britain thought. There are lots of letters exchanged in the late 18th century of people saying, I have ordered everyone in my household to eat brown bread, and, what a wonderful impact this will have. And it largely didn't work. And it was very disappointing to these members of the aristocracy who said, well, we've been eating all this brown bread and yet nobody else seems to want to eat it. So the idea that ordinary people were just imitating what wealthy people did doesn't seem to be historically borne out, which is not surprising. People's consumption practices aren't solely inspired by seeing what richer people do and copying them. But Parmentier tried the same tactic with potatoes. So he was encouraging the members of the French royal family to eat potatoes, or I think he was encouraging them to wear potato flowers in their hair as a kind of headdress. And He wrote about some banquets that he'd organized where every course contained potatoes, and he'd invited members of the great and good. So he certainly tried that attempt as well.
It's very much the same as today, though, right? We used to, celebrities are paid lots of money to use a certain product or eat a certain thing, and it's expected that people will follow. Isn't this the same royalty that said, let them eat cake? They must eat potato, but let them eat cake. I do find that the crop is so sort of easy to grow. I mean, it withstood a lot of diseases and weather situations that brought previous or traditional crops down, right? That was kind of why it took root so well for those couple of, well, even today, for those centuries. Is that sort of what made it the most popular thing?
I think that was part of the reason that it's become such a successful global food, because it really is very adaptable and it will grow in a wide variety of different climatic conditions. And it doesn't do this all by itself. It does this because farmers, great and small, for thousands of years have been adapting potatoes and engaging in the smaller grand scale breeding that's necessary to make potatoes grow in all sorts of different environments. So, I mean, plant breeders in India in the 20th century became field leading in developing varieties of potatoes that would grow in tropical and semi-tropical conditions, for example. And potatoes originate in the colder climate of the Andes and grow, they grew in a variety of climates even in the Andes, but they weren't so much a tropical crop. So over millennia, ordinary people, and also since the 20th century, scientists have been breeding potatoes to grow in lots of different spaces. So we should give credit to people as well as to plants for doing that. But it's certainly very, very amenable and can grow in all kinds of different conditions. It's very calorific. Potatoes per se aren't super calorific in themselves, but for a patch of land, they're calorific in terms of what you can get out of that patch of land. If you grow potatoes, you'll get more calories by far than if you were growing wheat, for example, in that same patch of land. It's very environmentally good. They don't use very much water compared to other crops. They are full of vitamin C. They have all kinds of wonderful qualities, which I think were appreciated by ordinary people all around the world, which partly explain their spread, as you were saying.
So it was in the Andes where obviously there's just lots of different altitudes going on and they were being grown all sort of way down the coast, right? And that's what sort of hardied them up to being possible in all these different places.
Yeah, so Andean farmers, past and present, would perhaps have a number of different bits of farmland that they would cultivate different crops on at different altitudes. So scholars talk about what they call ecological niches, where you wouldn't just have one allotment or one strip of land, but you might have different bits of land at different altitudes, and you'd grow different things on them so that you would have access to a quite wide variety of foodstuffs, just as you were saying.
Yeah, okay. And then as sort of Europeans came along and discovered them and decided they wanted to bring them back, is that how they ended up in places like India and Africa? Did they just sort of follow the European explorers and go along trade routes and then find route everywhere?
That's exactly right. So those, and the people who did that are, I would say nameless sailors who were traveling around. There's stories in Europe about Sir Walter Raleigh or Sir Francis Drake introducing potatoes to Europe, which really can't be true. He wasn't in the right places to be able to do that at the right times.
Right.
But even if he were, it seems that the routes that brought potatoes, as you said, for example, to India or to China, must have been dependent on ordinary sailors. So we know that potatoes were getting to India by the early 1600s, for example. We don't know who took them there. Probably Portuguese sailors involved in trading expeditions going to Goa or that part of the world. And people were definitely not taking potatoes as a commercial crop. They weren't being taken by people thinking, oh, this will be a trade good. I can use this to exchange for the commodities that we want from India, say. They weren't thinking, oh, we can trade these potatoes for Indian cotton. There's no evidence that that was being done or that they were being grown as a commercial crop on any large scale in that period. So sailors must have been taking them to eat, or because they thought they might be useful to grow. And we don't really know. But they seem to have been part of what people were taking in their own independent, small stocks of things that they traveled about with. I mean, the same seems to have been true of chili peppers as well, which also got to China, for example, by the 1590s, but not as a trade good, but as something that people were probably taking to season up their food on the long journey.
Right. So the most successful things are just because we just like them and because we want them, and not something that have been brought over for the sole purpose of whatever the journey was made for. That kind of makes me feel
Well, I don't know that we can say the most successful. I mean, going back to sugar, sugar is an incredibly successful global commodity whose malevolent effects on our health now we're all very aware of. And we're aware of its bad effects, as I was saying earlier, in terms of largely motivating the Atlantic slave trade. And it also had devastating environmental effects. I mean, it's terrible for the regions where it's grown. It desiccates the land. It leads to deforestation because people cut down trees to use the wood to heat the furnaces that fueled the sugar, the boiling houses and sugar plantations. And sugar is a terrible crop that has had horrible consequences for humanity and is very, very successful globally, as we know from the prevalence of sugar absolutely everywhere. But that was brought very much as a trade good. That was something that was brought. I mean, Columbus was taking sugarcane on his second journey in the hopes that he could set up a sugarcane plantation somewhere. So I wouldn't just say that the ordinary foods are the most successful. Some of the really terrible commercial foods are also very successful. But...
Yeah, that's true. What about corn? Because that is hugely successful too, right? Corn syrup is in so many foods. It sneaks its way in there. We think of corn as just sort of, corn on the cob that you just eat, but really it's used for so many products. Did that start out as a trade good, or was that just a sort of eating good?
That, I think, was more an eating food. So all of these starchy staples, like potatoes, like sweet potatoes, like corn, like cassava, that you mentioned earlier, those starchy foods that can provide a hearty background to your diet, traveled around the world, I think, as ordinary foods in almost all cases. I mean, everybody in the past ate very starchy diets. Starchy things, whether it was bread or a grain like rice or sorghum, or a root like a potato. That was what formed ordinary people's diets in most parts of the world. I mean, in Britain, for example, in the 18th century, I mean, that people argue about the precise numbers, but working people might eat like a pound of bread a day. Which is a lot.
How much is that? Like a loaf?
Yeah, I mean, you could, well, it depends on the loaf. You could go and,
Right, of course.
That if you get a kind of hearty sourdough bread or something, you can weigh it and see what that comes out as. So that's a lot of bread. So starch was the thing that people ate, and these starchy foods from the Americas have transformed people's diets everywhere. So that corn or maize got to West Africa by the mid 16th century. So that some of the enslaved people who were being, forcibly taken across the Atlantic from West Africa to go and work on, let's say, sugar plantations in the Americas would already have been eating maize in West Africa It already
Yeah.
had become common, and cassava is now a major foodstuff in many parts of Africa. In Uganda, for example, it's a super important foodstuff that comes from the Americas, but has now become
Mm.
a really important local food. Sweet potatoes reached China very early. Actually, there's a whole complicated story about where sweet potatoes originate, but they probably originated, well, they may have originated in the Americas. And they're now also a very common foodstuff in China. So these starchy foods have really gone everywhere. And they've settled in the places where they particularly flourish in terms of the environment.
Yeah. I mean, I guess then what I meant by most successful being sort of like they were grabbed on by ordinary people, right? And then they became part of that place's diet. And as well, like we were saying earlier, food is so connectable with people, it becomes part of who you are. Even today, I'm a vegan, I'm a vegetarian, I am on the keto diet. It becomes part of our sort of personal identity as well as national identity, right? And then I feel like the fact that it was these sort of everyday, it's being carried around the world because we're eating it rather than for some, financial or what would be the word? I don't know, like other purpose, that has made it such a global thing that make these foods very much just part of the overall human diet.
Yeah, it's really interesting, as you said, to contrast the foods that traveled because people were eating them versus the things that traveled for trade. So that makes a potato very different from a piece of Chinese porcelain, for example, which was a trade good and was being carried across the Pacific for the purposes of trade. I agree.
Yeah.
That's really a different thing.
Yeah, yeah. So with the sweet potato, you were saying it may have originated in America. What is it? Is it not related to the potato?
They're botanically totally different. So sweet potatoes, they're what are they related to? They're related to bindweed. You know, that really irritating thing that grows in your garden that with those sort of the
I don't know.
twisty vine that
Oh, right.
it's a garden pest, and so they're a totally different botanical species. Potatoes are they're related to chili peppers, they're related to aubergines, they're related to tomatoes, to a whole family called the solanums. And sweet potatoes are a totally different family. Different yet are cassava, which is again a different family. Yams from Africa are a different family. Jerusalem artichokes, another tuber that we sometimes see. Those are all botanically different, but people use them in very similar ways. But anyway, sweet potatoes were long thought to have originated in the Caribbean and the Atlantic coast of Brazil, because that was where Europeans encountered them. And so
Right,
Europeans wrote about them, and they said, this is a new thing. It's a bit like a yam from Africa. And
right.
so for insofar as historians were interested in where these things originated, that was the answer, probably in the Caribbean. And lately, there's been some really interesting research by ethnobotanists and people who use quite different types of sources that suggest that maybe sweet potatoes either originated in the Pacific or had a separate development in the Pacific, that they might have originated in several different places, that there wasn't necessarily a single point of origin, but that there are several different varieties of sweet potato, and some of them may have originated in the Pacific. And so Pacific Islanders who eat potatoes may have been eating them long before Europeans ever got to the Americas. And so it's possible that potatoes dispersed around the Pacific through a process that had nothing to do with the European age of exploration, if that makes sense.
Right.
What I think is really fascinating about your work is that we have these sort of what's known about history from what the Europeans wrote, because traditionally those have been the sources that have been available, right? Native Americans, didn't write a lot. They use a lot of oral history techniques, and so we had to kind of go off what Europeans were telling us, which has got a whole load of problems that I'm sure you don't want to get into, but skewed history and has told the globe what is important and who did what, which is, I think what's really exciting about the times right now is, like, as you were saying about research by ethnobotanists and sort of the use of new scientific work in what has happened before, we can kind of learn things that may have happened a different way, and I mean, how much of that is making up your work right now, using sources that aren't so traditional to tell things a different way?
It's a really good question. I mean, to my mind, some of the most exciting stuff that's happening in history right now has to do with the way in which historians have got interested in climate change as a historical topic, and are talking to scientists who are amassing data from, tree rings or a whole range of different types of source to try to construct a history of climate. And it's challenging for historians because it means that we either need to be collaborating with people from other disciplines who have expertise that we might not completely understand, and we might not have the technical knowledge to evaluate some of the science we might want to draw on, or we have to learn those skills. So this is the challenge whenever you try to work it with drawing on expertise from different areas. You either collaborate and let other people do things, or you try to learn it yourself so you can do it. But the result has been that histories of environment and climate have begun to really transform how we think about the past, and have allowed us to put climate into the historical narrative. So we don't just think about places and people, but we also think about what's happening in terms of the larger climate, which I think is very much in tune with with what we want to think about today. So it's not a coincidence. Historians don't just sort of sit in an ivory tower and think, it would be very interesting to think about climate in the past. We're influenced by what's going on now, just like everyone is.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, taking into account the environmental factors, it makes a huge difference in people's lives, what their environment is and how it's changing, and what decisions they might make based on that situation that they're in. It's very, very interesting. And sort of going back to the potato, because it was so hardy, didn't it? There were times, the Little Ice Age, for example, which is something around the 16th century, I believe, right, where it got very, very cold for a period of time. Was the potato played a role in that, I'm guessing, because it was a crop that could survive?
That's an interesting question. So that's actually something I haven't thought about the extent to which, in the mid-17th century, when, famously the Thames would freeze over and things like that, this is the so-called Little Ice Age, as you said, whether that was part of the spread of the potato, that is a really interesting question in terms of its, I need to think about that more. Yeah, that's a very good question.
maybe look into it. I don't know if something would come up there, but it's something that I'm really, really quite interested in, is how people make decisions, have made decisions over time about of what to do, because of, I did a research project on Native Americans and in the earlier colonial period, and how what they did and the changes that they made upon meeting the colonists, in terms of what they grew to sell to them and trade to them, and how they moved around the area, changed the area. And it was very, very difficult because, as we were saying, there wasn't a whole lot of resource material there available to tell me much. So I looked into a lot of sort of tree rings to see how things grew, and changes in the sort of like water ecology at the time. And it was really, really fascinating, because it felt like I was part of a new generation of people who were thinking about exactly that, as you were saying, how now we should be, in the last few decades, we've been taking more into account what the environment was doing, because we're understanding now what the environment can do, right?
Yeah, and as you were saying, it drives us to look for new sources. And those sources are there. We just need to think about it differently. So, for example, I mean, the point that you were making about the ways in which native peoples in the Americas modified the environment through which they moved, I think is a really important insight, and partly because it counters some of the old rhetoric in favor of colonialism that started to emerge from the 1500s or so, when Europeans were then traveling, in wider and wider circles, invading more and more parts of the world. And one of the standard justifications for why it was okay for Europeans to do this was that people in other parts of the world didn't use the lands that they happened to possess properly. There was this long-standing idea that if you didn't use your resources, including your landscape, your environment, properly, it didn't really belong to you, right? It wasn't really yours. If you just kind of frittered it away, it didn't belong to you. And so there was this long-standing tendency to denigrate agricultural practices of people in other parts of the world, saying, well, they don't do proper agriculture like we do in Europe. I mean, they don't know how to cultivate things. We need to come and show them how to do it. It will be to their benefit, in fact, because they'll learn proper agriculture. So the sort of story of native peoples not cultivating the land is connected to that bad history of justifying colonialism. It's also connected to a sort of romantic story of indigenous people living completely in harmony with nature in a way that's sort of, well, just romanticized. So it's not to say that native peoples were devastating the environment around them to the extent, in fact, which Europeans certainly did, but that native peoples weren't just moving through the landscape without having any effect on it. It wasn't true that they were just, striding through forests, harming nothing at all, and this kind of unrealistic picture of how anybody would engage with their environment is also being overturned by this new research, which shows that people engaged in the environment and modified it in ways that made it more beneficial for people in all kinds of really interesting ways. And to make this long story and to bring it back to the point that you were making, we can see this by looking at unfamiliar sources. So, for example, in the Amazon, it's been noted for some time that there's certain areas that have a very distinctive type of soil. There's a kind of dark black soil that accumulates in certain parts of the vast forest. And so scientists have been asking, where did that originate? How did that happen? And it seems that these areas of this dark black soil are places where indigenous peoples living in the forest had been engaging in cultivation, had been growing things or effectively gardening. And they'd been, we could sort of in shorthand say, manuring and enriching the soil in particular ways that allowed that region, that soil to be particularly fertile. We've got no written traces about these practices particularly, but we have the evidence of the soil that something made that happen. That didn't just occur naturally. And it makes sense that humans were doing that the same way in these forests, which, seem perhaps, vastly out of scale of any human interaction, that there's certain species that are useful to some of the groups of people who live in the forest tend to be concentrated in certain areas, and that there are more of these helpful trees and bushes in certain places, far more likely than would have occurred just through natural reproduction of these plants. So it seems likely that people were moving things, and they were planting saplings of trees in places where they wanted them to be. So we can read the forest, if we know how to do it, to see evidence of human agency and human engagement in feeding themselves.
That is so cool. That was kind of one of the outcomes of the research that I wrote, was to attack this idea, a very kind of racist idea that Europeans and some Asian populations were the only ones doing agriculture. They were the only ones actively changing the land for their benefit. And now, you know, once we disregard not disregard the importance, but once we sort of balance out the importance of European sources with other kinds of evidence that we can find now, we can prove that, you know, humans are humans. We have the same wants and needs, and, you know, we're going to try to do things that are going to benefit us. And it's almost this idea that with Native Americans or indigenous peoples in many places around the world living in harmony with nature, that they're almost like they were treated more closer to animal populations, that they were not so evolved as white people and the white races. They were more nature, and white people were more civilized, and you know, they did those kind of things, and yeah, that's been the held belief for a while, up until the last few decades. And it's really exciting now to see. I had no idea about that. That's like so interesting, and it's so deserved that we think about our ancestors in those places as well as the same, right? This is a question that I always ask people, but usually I'm asking scientists who are, you know, there is so much so many areas that they could look for evidence. But with a historian, I think it's quite a harder question. But now I feel like maybe it's not a hard question, in that if there was any source that you could find now, that you could access, written or otherwise, to find out something about the potato or you know, that age, what would it be? What would you want to know? So
sources that really exist, or sources that I don't think exist but I wish did?
Yes, so like, yes, if you could find a letter between two people, or I don't know, evidence of,
so not something that I'm really looking for because I think it's out there, but something that I wish were out there.
If it could, what question do you want to answer the most, I think is...
I would be really interested in evidence from those sailors who were taking potatoes to the western coasts of India in the 1600s. Why they were doing that? Why did they take potatoes? Who was it and why? Or the ordinary people in the mountainous regions in North China who were growing potatoes on their small plots of land long before 18th and 19th century sources started commenting on them. What did they think of them? Why were they doing that? Or the people in Spain who were beginning to eat them again by the late the late 1500s, early 1600s. That's what I would be really interested in, is the comments from the people from other parts of the world when they first encountered potatoes. Not the scientists. We have reports from botanists writing in the late 1500s saying, oh, we have this new root, it's come from the Americas, we don't know very much about it, it seems very interesting. We have those sources. I'd be really interested in more information about the ordinary people who were really the motor that fueled the potatoes' journey around the world, what they thought.
Oh, what do you imagine they think, like with sailors? What would you want to know?
Yeah, I guess I'd be really interested in general. What they were taking with them. What did they carry in their pockets, in their trunks, in their bags as they journeyed? So not just the food, but in general. We know there's a certain interesting scholarship on sailors who seem to have been sort of trendsetters in various ways. I mean, it's not surprising. You know, sailors go from place to place and they pick things up in one place and they drop them off somewhere else, and they introduce fashions and they introduce practices of all sorts because they're so mobile. So it's not surprising that they were spreading new food ideas. But I would just be very interested in hearing the voices of those sailors, of why they chose to travel with the particular things they took.
There's something so exciting about just ordinary life, right? When we go to museums and we see like the way ordinary people lived and the reconstructions of their outfits or their houses or something like that. Like that's the stuff, because you imagine that's what I would be doing if I was born 500 years ago. It's something so, it fits so well with what you were saying earlier about just the relevance of history coming from the people who are still living today, and just feeling like you want to connect with what used to be. Do you think potatoes will always be as popular as they are now?
Well, always is a big statement, but I see no reason to think that they're going to diminish in popularity. And there's been a sort of, well, the pandemic has been good and bad for potatoes. It's been bad for the potato harvest. I mean, just as lots of other crops have been having um, difficulties in terms of getting people to harvest them, and also because of, particularly during the period of really strict lockdown in many countries, the demand for potatoes from restaurants in particular plummeted. So crops didn't have a destination. I mean, the same way that we heard about quantities of beer being discarded in Britain because brewers didn't have the pubs to supply and they didn't have the bottling facilities to convert beer destined for pubs. I know. I mean, yeah, I mean, millions of liters of beer were apparently discarded just because, there was no outlet for them. The same with milk, that farmers in this country were discarding milk because all the coffee shops were shut. So there's been a problem with potatoes from that point of view.
Oh yeah,
But on the
wasn't
same
there in Belgium? Didn't they sort of do a big news alert saying, "Please, people, buy and eat potatoes because we have so many just like sitting here." Oh yes, I think I can send you a link to it. It was quite funny. It was like, eat chips, take the potatoes.
that rings a bell. Maybe, but send me I would be, yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's exactly why. That would be exactly why. But at the same time that there was this sort of crisis in the world of commercial potato growing, there's also been, as we may have encountered with people we know, a renaissance of people trying to grow things in their own back gardens or yards. Or I mean, there's been a run on seeds in general in Britain. So there are all kinds of things that are now very difficult to get hold of. Greenhouses became quite in short supply. If you wanted to order a greenhouse and seeds for plants and vegetables, there was also a period when they were really short supply because people were trying to grow their own food. And potatoes are certainly a super good food to grow if you want to get a lot of nourishment out of a small compass of land. So they've seen a sort of renaissance on that level at the same time that the trade has been in a bit of a crisis. But I see no indication that potatoes are on their way out. There's some evidence that the terrible potato blight that devastated Ireland and other parts of Europe in the mid-18th century is staging a return. So the late blight may come back. But other than that, I wouldn't say that there are particular reasons to fear for the future of the potato, the way there are about bananas, which are in really bad shape because of a virus, or is it a virus, a pathogen of some sort that's damaging banana plantations. I would say the potato is doing okay.
What's this? The late blight may come back. Is this the same pathogen, the same disease from before?
Yeah, and apparently so this was, my mother is a plant breeder, and so she talks to other plant breeders, and she says apparently there's concern that this that blight, that pathogen that was responsible for the Irish Great Famine, may be staging a return, and that we don't really have good countermeasures to put in place. But part of the reason that virus was so devastating, or that pathogen was so devastating in Ireland, was because the variety of potatoes that was being grown was largely one. It was really a monoculture, and that, as we know, pathogens rip through monocultures, which is why bananas are in trouble. But potato cultivation globally isn't so monolithic. So even, God forbid, that this comes back, I don't think it'll have the same effect as it did just in Ireland in the 1840s.
Mm-mm. We need variety, and variety keeps us safe. I mean, that's again why it was so successful in the Americas, right? Is because they bred, they sort of stretched it out and made lots of different varieties so that there was always something that worked. It would be a real shame if that did happen though, because as we were saying, potatoes are really they're not very water intensive in comparison to other sort of like carb foods, right? So they seem like a good idea to keep in the diet, keep promoting as we sort of walk ourselves into climate change.
I agree. And it was for that reason that in 2008, the UN declared International Year of the Potato.
I did not know about that. We need another one of those, although how often do you eat potato? I hardly ever eat it, but thinking about today, I had some for dinner.
Well, I eat them quite a lot because I get a lot of my vegetables from a local farm, which is a wonderful place called Canal Side that I couldn't recommend highly enough. And they grow a lot of potatoes, and so I eat a lot of, my vegetables tend to consist of what I get from the farm share. And we get a lot of potatoes, so I eat a lot of potatoes. And I like potatoes, but I've had potatoes for the last 4 nights for dinner, partly because we got 1.5 kilos on Saturday.
That is such a very good outlook on food, to go source locally and then eat what you've got. We all need to be thinking like that. But from knowing what you do about how crops sort of diversify and how they got domesticated initially before the sort of global spread, how does that make you feel about like GMOs and crop gene editing and things like that?
Well, so this is certainly not my area of expertise.
No, but just your opinion as a human, as someone who eats food.
Yeah, so I guess there are 2 dimensions to the debate about it, as I understand it. So one has to do with the actual practice of gene editing and the new technologies, the CRISPR technology that is being developed, and the sorts of plant genetic engineering that's been going on. So on the one hand, there's a debate about whether that's a good thing in itself. And then the other side of it has to do with the way in which those genetically modified plants get marketed and sold, and is connected to critiques of Monsanto and to the ways in which these genetically modified foods have been embedded in larger political economies and power structures. And so, those are connected, but they're not entirely the same. So it's very clear that the way in which the plants that were associated with the Green Revolution in the 1960s, for example, it's very clear that a number of those hybrid varieties had good effects in some ways in terms of actually reducing famine, and terrible effects in others in terms of increasing rural insecurity and reducing the autonomy of small farmers in many parts of the world. So that seems to have had and there's a huge debate about that. And, for people who sort of saying, well, in the end they were good, or in the end they were terrible. But it's clear that they had both qualities. So, there's that. And that has to do particularly with the way in which these F1 hybrids don't reproduce. You need to buy more seed. You need to use a lot of fertilizer to make a lot of them grow productively. There's a whole story about that. The other has to do with more an ethical debate about whether we think it's right to be engaging in these types of interventions, whether they're likely to have unexpected consequences in other parts of the environment, which is sort of a different type of debate.
Yeah.
So I guess I would say there's sort of, 2 debates really about it.
Yeah. The first one, what you were saying about how they sort of like have grabbed onto farmers and have forced a system upon us all is quite a scary topic to get into. But with the sort of morality about changing a crop or changing any part of nature for human benefit, I feel like when you really boil it down, it's really difficult to argue, because we've been doing it for thousands of years. That's exactly how we got here. That's why we have edible potatoes. That's why we have pet dogs. That's why we, have cattle. I feel like it's scary now because it can be so precise and we're so good at it in a way, and so then the power that humans could have seems so much greater, and potentially there should be limits put in place. But yeah, in terms of the ethics of whether it's right or wrong, I feel like that argument was won, in the Fertile Crescent 12,000 years ago.
I have to say, I mean, I agree about that. I mean, the number of varieties of genetically modified foodstuffs that are licensed for sale is really tiny. So it's like, I think, like 4 different things. So it's not that it's everywhere. It's a very small variety of foods that have those licenses. But I agree with you. Intervening with and engaging in the processes of domestication and what I guess gets called improvement has been going on, as you said, since the Fertile Crescent. That's a very good way of expressing it.
Thank you. I also read one bit of news when I just Googled potato news to see what would come up, what's happened recently. And I read that scientists are trying to develop out of the potato that loves the salty soil in Peru, they're trying to sort of pull it to its extremes because the environment on Mars is apparently very saline. And so if we were to colonize, we may take the potato with us.
So life follows fiction or follows film.
Right. So is this
like in The Martian?
Something.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
Matt Damon, he grows potatoes on Mars, so...
Oh, right. So everybody already knew about that. Well, it's happening in real life.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. That's rather wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. The spread of the potato continues.
I didn't realise salinity was a factor either. That's really interesting.
I'll send you that link as well.
Please do.
Yeah.
It's impossible to keep up with the world of potatoes. It's constantly on the move.
Right, exactly. It's not done yet. The age of exploration was not its peak. This has been really fun. Thank you so much for your time.
It's been absolutely lovely. Thank you for being interested.
Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Bye-bye.